Hey guys, and you read that right. I actually decided to start watching Hell's Kitchen, going season by season, and I decided to do a chef ranking for season 1. So in this video, I'll be ranking all 12 chefs from season 1 based on how well I think they played during the season. And again, this is a ranking of how well they did on the season versus how well they'll probably do on any given season of Hell's Kitchen. But there are 12 chefs to look at, and unless I'm wasting any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 12, the chef I believe did the worst on this season is Dewberry. And obviously the main thing with Dewberry is that he does survive an elimination, and even survives over the next person we'll be talking about. But I still think he did worse over the course of the season, where the only truly positive thing to note about his performance is in episode 2, where he does pretty well in the squid challenge, being able to clean 2 squids there. But outside of that, everything else is pretty bad. He obviously has a pretty bad signature dish due to being overcooked, and I feel like he performed worse during Service 1 to where he realistically could have been eliminated there after being put up on the block, but he is spared for one more round. And obviously, Service 2 is even worse, where he almost walks out of the kitchen. And while he does come back, by that point, his fate was sealed. He was going home no matter what. And obviously, he's a pretty bad chef across the season, and someone who clearly was not cut out to be a head chef, which is why he's here at number 12. Now, moving on to number 11, and we are going back to the first boo of the season, and here we have Carolyn. And again, there is a debate for Carolyn being at the bottom, as at the end of the day, she had almost no cooking experience and realistically was never going to do well on this season. But I feel like she didn't do as much wrong compared to Dewberry across the first episode, where she actually made a pretty good signature dish, one of the few people to get positive remarks there. And while she's eliminated due to her not helping much during the dinner service, she actually did alright with the food she was making, where she managed to get out a dessert that was well received. So I think there's a debate for her staying over Dewberry even when she was nominated. But I feel like at the end of the day, she was eliminated more so due to her inexperience and lack of potential moving forward, even though Dewberry made more blatant mistakes during his time in Hell's Kitchen. So for that reason, I did decide to have her one spot higher at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have a chef that's very hard to assess in my eyes, and here we have Jeff, the next boot on the season. And I think what's hard about Jeff is he was obviously going through a lot of pain during the season where he was passing kidney stones, and a lot of the other chefs weren't really taking him seriously, and they didn't seem to like him by the end of it. And obviously he does end up quitting by the end of it, where he does storm out of the kitchen after being fed up with everything going on. But at the end of the day, I feel like if you are just looking at the game that he played, it was mostly mediocre, where he does actually have an okay signature dish during episode 1, which is worth highlighting. But obviously he's put on as the waiter during the first service, and he does pretty poorly during a lot of it, where obviously he gets pretty poor remarks there. And it's actually a shock that he was not nominated during the first episode despite this bad service. But even after that, he still doesn't do well. He has a pretty mediocre service 2 where he's losing focus for a lot of it. And while some of that can be due to the pain, that obviously gets him on the target list, causing him to be nominated there. And then obviously during episode 3, he's largely out of it. And again, I don't know how much of this is due to the pain that he was going through, but obviously it leads to him being seen as a weakness on his team. And eventually it just becomes too much for him, where he does storm out of the kitchen, leaving Hell's Kitchen altogether. So again, if we are just looking at it on face value, it is a pretty bad game, and one in which he very rarely does anything right. But again, the main thing that I was thinking about is the amount of pain that he was going through and how much that factored into it. But at the end of the day, that was the game that he played. So because of that, I do have him here at number 10. Now moving on to number 8, and we are sticking with the boot order here, and here we have Wendy. And I think Wendy was a pretty fun figure across the season, someone who claimed to be a perfectionist only to cut to her making mistakes. But I feel like she's, again, one of the weaker chefs on the cast, and someone that never really had a high point during the season, where obviously she has a bad signature dish in episode 1. During episode 2, she does pretty poorly at the squid challenge. And outside of that, she's kind of just there for the first 2 services, doesn't really make any major mistakes, but also doesn't really do anything too impressive. And then episode 3, that's where she is eventually taken out, with her not knowing how to cook lamb and her thinking that cold water boils faster than hot water, which is pretty funny. And again, she is nominated alongside Andrew, who, again, while is the better chef, is someone that has a worse attitude. And I think Ramsey cut her more so because she just wasn't cut out for it and had less potential moving forward than Andrew. So again, it's a mostly mediocre run, which is why she's here number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have one of the more notorious chefs on the season, and here we have Andrew. And I feel like Andrew is the type of player that was largely kept around due to how much drama he was causing, where he would get into fights with Ramsey, he'd get annoyed by Ralph, he would try taping the door open during the punishment, and obviously he was a pretty bad chef, where right off the bat he has a bad signature dish that Gordon ends up spitting out, and he very rarely has a good service, where during service 1, like he's putting out desserts but no one likes them. Service 2 is arguably his best service, but even then, like he gets into fights with Mary Ellen and he tries throwing her under the bus. During Service 3, it's his dish that's named the worst by the critics, and he ends up getting nominated after the blue team loses, the first opportunity of the season that he has to be nominated. And considering that he got into a fight with Ramsey in that service, he very easily could have been the boot there, but he ends up skating through that. Service 4, he's on the garnish station, and he does pretty terribly at that, holding up a lot of the kitchen there, and he ends up getting nominated yet again after they lose the challenge. And yet he ends up being saved over Mary Ellen, who clearly was a better chef in that situation, and I think was one of the more blatant cases of Andrew being kept around for drama, more so than his abilities as a chef. We then have Ralph calling him the weakest link on the blue team, which is then followed up by another pretty bad service, though they end up winning that. And then we get to his boot episode where he has another pretty bad service where he's on the halibut station. He is constantly overcooking the halibut and he ends up falling behind on the orders. He also gets into trouble with Scott after trying to get out of the punishment. And at that point, it just became too much for Ramsey, and he ends up getting eliminated there. So on the whole, it's a pretty bad game on Andrew's end. And I feel like most of the reason he gets as far as he does is, 1, the blue team winning as much as they did early on, where they did win the first 2 services, and plus he was kept around for drama, even though he was clearly the worst chef there, where he was literally nominated at every single elimination he was eligible for. So all in all, I think it's a pretty bad game, which is why he's here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have another pretty mediocre chef that made it decently far, and we actually have the first black jacket on the board, and here we have Jimmy. And while Jimmy wasn't nominated as much as Andrew, or wasn't nearly as combative, he was still a pretty mediocre chef that kind of just skated through a lot of the game, where early on he has a bad signature dish, kind of similar to Andrew. Ramsey ends up spitting it out, and he follows that up with a pretty bad first service where he could have been nominated, but is able to get through that situation alright. And he kind of does alright in episode 2, but then in episode 3, he has a pretty bad service there where he screws up the meat, and he does pretty poorly during the reward challenge there. Service 4, he makes another mistake where he ends up making a cold garnish, but they end up winning that service anyway. Episode 5, he gets called the weakest link by Chris, and obviously this is the episode that focuses a lot on him like being messy with the fact that a lot of his dishes are kind of sloppy. That kind of plays out during the service, even though his actual output is not that bad. And then obviously follows that up by being pretty terrible as a waiter, where he's sending dishes to the wrong table, and JP ends up yelling at him for him being sweaty and him touching himself, and he very easily could have been nominated after that service, but Michael decides to target Chris instead. We then get to episode 6, where he obviously has a pretty bad service once again, where Michael has to take over for his station. That's not great. And then we get to the Black Jackets, where he ends up winning the Flambe Challenge, which is really the one major highlight for him across the season. But then he follows it up with a very terrible service where he obviously ends up throwing out the lobster at one point. He messes up a risotto. He gets into an argument with Ramsey, and he ends up being taken out that round due to that terrible service. But even outside of that, like, he was already the weakest chef out of the 5 Black Jackets, which made it clear that his time was pretty much done at that point. So again, I find Jimmy's run to not be that impressive. I feel like he was definitely one of the weaker chefs to make it far into the season, and I feel like there were several opportunities during the season where he could have been taken out earlier, but he wasn't. So because of that, he is here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have the earliest boot left to talk about, and here we have Mary Ellen. And I feel like Mary Ellen, while not the greatest chef in the world, clearly was better than Andrew and Jimmy, and probably should have made it to Black Jackets, but was taken out largely due to Andrew being this bigger TV character, and I feel like that was a big reason why she was taken out as early as she was. But if we are looking at a run, I find a lot of it to be kind of unremarkable, where her service 1 is alright, and while she has a pretty boring signature dish, I feel like it wasn't as bad as plenty of other ones. Service 2, she does pretty well at the squid challenge, but then follows that up with a mediocre service where she screws up a Wellington and she argues with Andrew. We then get to episode 3, where she does pretty well during the challenge, but the actual service is just kind of fine. We then get to her boot run, where admittedly her service wasn't that great. She ends up making a pretty bad risotto that the customer sends back. She screws up another order, causing the team to slow down. And again, all of it's like not great, But I feel like compared to Andrew, I feel like she was clearly the better chef between them, and I feel like her performance up to that point was better than Andrew's. And yet she ends up getting taken out for this service despite the fact that Andrew was the worst overall chef. So I think that kind of props her up on the power ranking to a degree. And while I wouldn't say she's the greatest chef in the world, I feel like she definitely deserved to make it a little further than what she ended up making it. And because of that, she is here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5. And I was also kind of conflicted on this person. I actually considered putting this person below Mary Ellen at one point. But we actually have the highest ranked person to not make black jackets. And here we have Chris. And I think something that really weighed Chris down was his overconfidence, admittedly, but also the fact that he was an executive chef. And that's something that Ramsay harped on a lot whenever he made a mistake. But I feel like if we are looking at his performance, while it wasn't as consistent as Mary Ellen's, I feel like it has some higher highs. Where admittedly, right at the bat, like he has a bad signature dish that's pretty bad, and obviously Ramsay chews him out for it. But then he follows it up with a pretty solid service, so whatever. He then leaves a bad impression in episode 2 by being late to the roll call, and then he does pretty poorly in the squid challenge where he messes up 3 and only gets through 1. But then he does very well in the service where he ends up winning best of the worst despite his team losing the challenge, so I find that pretty impressive. And then episode 3, again, he does pretty poorly in the challenge, but is able to make up for it with a good service. Episode 4, he outright wins the service, does pretty well there. And then we get to his food episode where obviously he calls himself the strongest link on the red team, which obviously paints a target on his back, only to follow it up by losing the service. And while he doesn't really make any mistakes during that service, this is obviously the point where Michael ends up winning the best of the worst, and he ends up deciding to target Chris due to him being the biggest around the board. And considering this was a point in Hell's Kitchen history where Ramsay couldn't overrule the nominations, that forced him to choose between Chris and Elsie, and considering the target that Chris already had on his back due to him being an executive chef and Ramsay having higher standards for him, that's obviously where he gets cut. So I think to a degree kind of gets screwed over by Michael playing more strategically, and while there are plenty of faults you can turn to with Chris's game and some of his bad services, I think he was still one of the better chefs from the pre-Black Jackets, which is why he's here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and obviously we are now at the final 4, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 4, I actually decided to break away from the boot order a bit, and we actually have Jessica, who ended up being the 3rd place finisher. And I feel like compared to Jessica and Elsie, who she ended up doing better than, I feel like Jessica's run is less consistent than Elsie's, where early on, a lot of her run is pretty unremarkable, kind of just getting through the early rounds. She obviously has a bad signature dish in episode 1, but to be fair, most people had a bad signature dish. Then we get to episode 3, where I feel like she has a pretty bad service, where she ends up doing pretty poorly there, and could have been nominated, but is able to avoid that. We then get to episode 4, where she does finally start to turn it up by having a pretty solid service. Now, mind you, I think she is helped out a bit by Ralph's leadership, but through this, she ends up winning best of the worst, and she ends up nominating Andrew and Mary Ellen, with Andrew as a target, only for her to be blindsided when Mary Ellen goes out instead. I find that kind of interesting. We then get to episode 5, where from this point on, she starts to recognize that Michael is playing more strategically. She knows that he's the one behind the whole plan of pushing lasagna orders during their time, but even with that, her team still ends up winning the service. During episode 6, she goes 0 for 4 on the blind taste test, which is pretty bad. And then during the service, she ends up having a hair fall on one of her dishes. And while she claims it wasn't her hair, it was still her dish, and she ended up getting a lot of blame for it. But she still ends up winning best of the worst after the service, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. But then we get to the Black Jackets, where she goes back to having a pretty bad service, where she runs out of fillets at one point and gets into a fight with Ramsay. And while this is possibly sabotage from Michael, as he ends up magically coming up with the fillets, she still ends up getting nominated after the service by Ralph, someone who she had already promised safety when she was best of the worst. We then get to service 8, which is also pretty bad, where she ends up screwing up multiple dishes, which is pretty bad. She also has a piece of wood fall into one of her dishes, which is just kind of strange. She ends up getting nominated by Ramsay at the service, and is largely saved by Elsie having more of a meltdown at that round. And even that was more so the other players ganging up on her due to them being jealous of her winning the talk show reward. So I find that situation kind of wonky. And then we get to the final 3, where she is clearly the worst chef of those 3. She ends up getting last place in the souffle challenge. She has a pretty mediocre service, and in the end, she gets by far the least amount of votes to stay, causing her elimination. So I find Jessica's game kind of weird, where on one hand, she definitely has moments of greatness. She ends up winning 2 best of the worst throughout the season. but she's also a very inconsistent chef and someone who obviously was prone to mistakes at points. And I feel like by the end, she was clearly outclassed to where I feel like she was coming up short. So because of that, I do have her here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have the highest ranked chef to not make it to the end, and here we have Elsie. And I feel like Elsie is slightly more consistent than Jessica, even though in the face of it, she has lower highs than Jessica. Where early on, she has one of the better signature dishes out of the people there, and while the first service ended up being a disaster, she ended up winning best of the worst at the first round, which is pretty good, and I feel like she does pretty well over the next few services, not really making many mistakes. But then she's nominated after Service 5, which is obviously not great, but she ends up staying over Chris, who was an executive chef, so I do find that somewhat impressive. We then get to Service 6, where she does pretty well in the taste test, getting 3 out of 4 there, which is pretty good. But then she follows it up with a pretty mediocre service where her menu item was not well received by the customers, but they're still able to get through that round all right. But then we get to the Black Jackets, which is obviously a pretty notable episode, where she comes in second during the flambe challenge, but Jimmy, who ends up winning that challenge, does not pick her for the reward, and later chooses her to serve tableside, even though she clearly doesn't know how to make a salad, and she ends up doing pretty poorly during the service, though she's able to avoid nomination there. But then we get to her boot round, which is obviously a pretty notorious episode, where first up she wins the reward, which not only allows her to go onto a talk show with Ramsay, but then later allows her to pick the initial stations for the service, and this gets on a lot of the players' nerves. It does seem like during the service, they are just kind of ganging up on her where they just won't communicate with her. And while she does okay during her initial station, she ends up floundering after Ramsay starts rotating people around, and she ends up having this massive meltdown that eventually leads to her elimination. Where even at her elimination, we see how proud Ramsay is of her, considering how little experience she had coming into it, and that it felt like a lot of her elimination came down to just how bad that one service was. So I feel like that was one big factor in why I had her above Jessica on this ranking. And also I feel like outside of that, I feel like Elsie was a more consistent chef throughout the season than Jessica. Where even though Jessica won 2 best of the worst while Elsie only won 1, I feel like Jessica had more low points during her season. So I feel like that was something at least. Though I will say the main thing about Elsie and why she isn't higher is that I feel like even if she had survived the final 4, I feel like 3rd was about as high as she was getting, as I feel like Michael and Ralph were by far the best chefs on the season and were pretty much destined to get to the final 2 together. So I think that was also a factor, but I still find Elsie's game mostly impressive on the season, which is why she's here at number 3. Now we're moving on to number 2, and I feel like there's a pretty big gap between number 3 and number 2, as we obviously have the final 2 of the season, as I feel like these 2 were by far the best chefs on the season, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But at number 2, I decided to go with the runner-up of the season, and here we have Ralph. And I think the thing about Ralph is, even though the show tries to present him as being this more out in front leader compared to Michael, I think he was also more prone to mistakes than Michael that eventually led to his downfall, where I feel like a lot of his early game is pretty good, where early on he has a good service 1, even though he's annoyed by having to be the waiter, he still does pretty well there. Service 2 is also pretty good, he ends up cleaning 2 squids during the challenge as well. During service 3 is where he really starts to take on the leadership role, and while they lose that service, he ends up winning best of the worst there. He ends up nominating Andrew and Wendy. Service 4 is also pretty good, where he's shown making cheat sheets to speed up the service. Then we get to Service 5, where sort of similar to Chris, he ends up calling himself the strongest link on the blue team, but then he follows it up with a pretty solid service where he does pretty well as the waiter, and while he makes a minor mistake in being messy with the tomato in the pan, he still ends up winning the service and does pretty well. Then we get to episode 6, which I think is a bit more rocky, where first up he costs his team the challenge by going 0 for 2 on the blind taste test, which is pretty funny, but then he takes charge by coming up with all the items on the menu, and while his team is able to get out more orders during the service, they end up getting worse reviews and they end up losing the challenge. And he even gets nominated by Ramsay at the elimination, the only time all season that he ends up on the block. Now mind you, the team was down to 3 by that point, and it would have been weird if they just went with one nominee as Jessica ended up doing so, but still, he was still on the block in a spot where Michael was never on the block. He then turns it around at the Black Jackets, where he ends up winning best of the worst there and nominates Jimmy and Jessica. At the final 4, he ends up doing pretty well at the leftovers challenge, where he makes this restaurant quality dish, but he ends up losing due to not utilizing the ingredients. But then he follows it up with a pretty solid service where he's able to stay safe there. At the final 3, he does win the reward challenge that gives him first choice over meats for his signature dish, but even then Michael still outclasses him where his dish gets more votes than his, but he's still able to get to the final 2. And then we get to the final service, which is kind of rocky, where he ends up coming up with this more traditional style of restaurant, which kind of pales compared to Michael's more contemporary feel. He's also tricked by Michael into slipping through a risotto that has no crab on it during the practice run, which is pretty bad. And then during the service, while he's able to command more respect than Michael for a lot of it, he's also getting bogged down by actually getting into the stations and doing a lot of the food himself, which kind of leads to a slow output, even though the food itself is great. And while he's arguably a better leader than Michael, I feel like a lot of the reason he loses at the end is due to him like micromanaging people and kind of getting bogged down, and also him like not having as creative ideas compared to Michael. So I feel like to that end, while Ralph was definitely one of the best chefs on the season, I feel like Michael still outclassed him by the end of it, which is why he's here number 2. And now, at number 1, the chef I believe played the best game on Hell's Kitchen 1 is the winner of the season, and here we have Michael. Now, while his signature dish ends up being pretty bad, and Ramsay says that he has the palate of a cow's backside, he still has a pretty solid start where he has a pretty good service 1, where really the only minor thing worth noting is him not finding the lobsters for the pasta. Service 2 is also pretty solid. In episode 3, he swapped over to the red team due to him being one of the stronger chefs from the blue team. Then we get to the service where the critics are kind of mixed on his output, where some people don't like his food, some people do like his food, so there's that. Episode 4 is pretty strong, he has a pretty good service there. But then we get to service 5, which is a bit more interesting, where obviously that's the pasta night challenge, and his team, the red team, ends up cooking first. And with them knowing that the blue team will be cooking second, and that knowing that the kitchen was low on lasagna, Michael has an interesting idea of pushing lasagna onto the customers so that they'll order it, and that way the blue team will run out of lasagna during service and kind of look bad as a result, which is a pretty strategic move for this early on in Hell's Kitchen history. And while it kind of backfires and the red team still loses the service, he ends up winning best of the worst, which then leads to another interesting move, where rather than simply put up the 2 weakest chefs from his team, he ends up making a pretty big swing and targeting Chris due to him being a big threat and due to him declaring himself the strongest link on the team. And it actually works as Ramsay ends up eliminating Chris at that elimination ceremony, which is pretty good. Service 6 is also pretty solid, where his filet mignon is pretty well received, and he ends up taking up some leadership during the service by taking over people's stations when they need help. Then we get to the Black Jackets, which is also a pretty interesting round, where in the middle of the service, Jessica ends up running out of fillets, only for Michael to somehow know where they are and come up with them to look good in front of Ramsay and make Jessica look bad by default. I think the final 4 is a bit more shaky, where he doesn't do that well in the leftovers challenge, even leaving bones in his dish. And then during the service, while he isn't nominated, Ramsay still calls him out for not communicating well with the other players. But I think the final 3 is where he starts to turn it up, where even though Ralph gets the first choice of meat for the signature dish, Michael still outclasses him by the end of it, where he ends up getting by far the most amount of votes of the loved ones in deciding who stays, so he ends up winning that battle. And then we get to the final service, where while he does have struggles in asserting himself during a lot of the service, where a lot of the players don't listen to him as much as Ralph, he's still able to undercut Ralph on multiple opportunities, where first you have them taking their signature dishes out onto the street, where Michael clearly wins in a 12-6 vote. You also have during the practice run where he's able to trick Ralph into accepting a risotto that doesn't have crab in it. That results in it being sent back, making Ralph look bad there. And while I think a lot of his service is rocky, where again, leadership is an issue, he also accepts some pretty questionable dishes that makes him look bad. He's still able to come out on top by the end of it due to him having more fresh ideas than someone like Ralph. So I think on the whole, I think Michael's game is probably more consistent than Ralph's, where even though Ralph seemed to be more ready to take on the head chef position, I think Michael still was able to avoid trouble more than Ralph, where he was never nominated. He also doesn't make as many mistakes as Ralph, and while I can definitely question his leadership skills at points, he's still able to be sort of a silent leader for a lot of the season, where there were multiple points where he would help out people at their stations when they were struggling, and by the end of it, he did seem to raise his standards to where he was able to command respect during the end of that service.
So I think by the end of it, it made sense why Michael won. And I think with him having a cleaner ride to the end than Ralph, I think he's by far the best chef of the season, which is why he's here at number 1. And there we go. That'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. Really helps with the channel. Now, I might end up doing more of these down the road where as I watch more seasons, I'll probably do more chef rankings for those as they come along, so you can stay tuned for that. I'm on Patreon now, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.